Hello everyone, I am Mohammad Bilal Iftikhar Khan and you are listening to the Strategic Analysis Group podcast. In a tragic turn of events, armed assailants launched a deadly terror attack on Turkish aerospace company near Ankara on October 23, 2024. CCTV footage shows two attackers armed and carrying backpacks approaching the facility's entrance. According to Turkey's interior minister, the attackers have been identified as members of Kurdistan Workers' Party or PKK. In response, Turkey launched strikes in Kurdish regions of Syria and Iraq. The attack tragically claimed 5 lives, including 4 employees of the factory and a taxi driver, and left 22 others injured. The incident followed a significant statement by Turkish National Movement party leader in parliament hinting a potential concession, further complicating an already tense situation. Joining us today is Irina Tsukerman, a distinguished national security and human rights lawyer, journalist, and geopolitical analyst. Irina brings invaluable expertise in our discussion. Together, we will explore the root of Turkish-Kurdish relations and what this incident means for regional stability. Thank you, Irina, for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. I'll start the discussion with the basic question: what are the historical roots of Turkish-Kurdish conflict, and how has it evolved over the years?
The Turkish-Kurdish conflict started a long time ago. The roots lie in the Sykes-Picot Treaty and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. During the Ottoman Empire, Kurds were very much part of that structure. They served in the military. They had been very much integrated into society, and Kurds were, of course, divided between the Ottoman Empire and Persia at the time. With the division of the Middle East by the British and the French in the first half of the 20th century, around the time of World War One and after World War One, Kurds ended up being divided between 4 newly created countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And of course, they were never consulted on the creation of these treaties. The focus has been very much on the Arab populations, and the Kurds ended up being one of the biggest nations left without, in the Middle East, left without a state of their own. They were never part of the newly enforced nationalism, which was in some ways a profit for mostly tribal societies of the Middle East. Turkey went in a different direction. Ataturk essentially forced modern day nationalism on the big cities in Turkey, and some of it came with a very conformist Turkish national identity. Many of the Kurds did join this national movement. They became part of Kemalist parties, but not all of them. Many of the ones who were not active in politics and who did not live in cities like Istanbul, who lived in the majority Kurdish areas, remained very much informed by their ethnic identity, culture, language, and in many ways were fairly autonomous, but this sort of conformist Kemalist identity was not necessarily a good fit for everyone. It was not like, for instance, American nationalism, which allows U.S. citizens to have a national identity, but at the same time retain a connection to their cultures, dresses, the wish, study their own language, and so forth. It was not really a melting pot. It was also not a great way of integrating people in some ways. There was always this tension, and that tension came with some discriminatory practices. It came with abuses against those who were seen as not fitting this new national mold. There was this effort to create this one national identity based very much on what the Kurds perceived as an ethnic Turkish culture which was distinct from their own identity. And the irony in all of this is that most of the Turks were themselves of mixed descent. So there was never a consultation on how this process should work. There was very much the Ataturk movement winning the war and taking the country in a direction that was seen to be modernizing, and in many ways it certainly was. So all of that created areas of vulnerability and exploitation.
Which countries or organizations have provided financial and military support to Kurdish groups, these terror groups who attacked Turkish space factory, aerospace factory, and how has it this impacted the conflict?
When the Soviet Union started supporting liberation movements around the world in the 1960s and 70s as a way to essentially attack the West and downplay the Western involvement in the Middle East. It started supporting the PLO. It also started supporting the PKK. PKK was a national liberation movement by the Kurds. At the time, in the 70s, it was not the only Kurdish organization, but it was the organization that very much attacked other organizations, eventually destroying them, actually, with Soviet support. It was very much pushing a socialist Marxist identity on the Kurds in Turkey and some of the Kurds in Syria. Not everyone followed that. There were Kurds who were unaffiliated, there were Kurds who were Islamist, and there were Kurds who were just fairly moderate. But Turkey never had, in particular, never had a sort of a classical liberalism that flourished in other societies. It never had that sort of a liberal mindset that some of the, for instance, Arab reformers had. It was very much an ethno state in certain ways, with that conformist identity and a very illiberal, in some ways authoritarian culture. So the PKK at the time was also in many ways an illiberal organization of its own kind. It became a terrorist organization. It killed and attacked civilians in response to what it perceived as Turkish injustices, but also with the assistance and the framework pushed very much by the Soviet Union. So it was both a clash of these cultures, but also a clash of the Cold War sides. It even killed an American, which landed PKK on the U.S. Terrorist list eventually. PKK essentially eliminated competing visions of identity among the Kurds, even competing visions of liberation. The Soviet model was what went out. The Soviet model headed by Öcalan, who ended up in a Turkish prison where he continued serving as a sort of guiding vision for the group. Over time, and eventually, after many years of conflict, PKK decided to move away from attacking civilians, and they stopped attacking civilians completely. But the tensions with the Turkish state continued. And eventually, there was a sort of a compromise vision that emerged over a potential for autonomy, creating an autonomous federal Kurdish region, which also became complicated because it's not easy to create an autonomous region if you have a mixed population living there, and it was also Turkish population and others living in that region. Would it have a separate system? How would the governance work? When Erdogan and AKP came to power, they came to power with a new vision. First of all, it was based on Islam as a uniting front for all of the groups, and many of the Kurds, even the ones who were socialist or just not religious, welcomed that because they thought that would shift away the focus from the nationalism that had served them not so well for many years. For others, Erdogan explicitly claimed that he would solve this Kurdish issue and would engage in peace talks with the PKK and create a sort of transition to autonomy. And initially, that's exactly what was going on for the first few years of AKP in power, there were peace talks, and there was a lot of support among Kurds for the AKP. But the AKP was a Muslim Brotherhood based model. It was always going to be a religious model. And in fact, once the economy started floundering, Erdogan quickly sought to distract from AKP's political and economic losses. He started scapegoating the Kurds, and essentially PKK became active again. Moreover, many of the Kurds exasperated by what they perceived as Erdogan's betrayal of the promise to create an autonomy and a more equitable society, to allow the study of Kurdish language, to allow a more active Kurdish involvement in politics beyond the kind of Islamist or nationalist parties. They actually started joining PKK in bigger numbers, not because they agreed with the initial vision of the PKK. The Soviet Union, after all, no longer existed, or with its original ideology or philosophy, but because by that point that was the only Kurdish organization left standing. When HDP, the leftist Kurdish party, was created, that was also seen as the only option for many Kurds, not because they necessarily agreed with every political argument, but because they saw it as representing their cultural interest against the rise of anti-Kurdish nationalism, as well as Islamism that many of them rejected. So it's a complicated story, and there's not really a very smooth transition or an easy solution, because the Turkish model of nationalism that does not necessarily fit everyone equally well, and also because the Kurds were never consulted in any aspect of this creation. It's also, the Kurds have been ill-served by what they perceived as treacherous alliances with different powers, Westerners at some points, Russia and Soviet Union at other points, none of whom really helped in the creation of a Kurdish state, or in terms of creating some sort of a consistent autonomy with a clear constitutional protection for Kurdish rights. There's been lots of violations. Turkey, as a member of European courts, has been forced to essentially pay judgments for destruction and confiscation of Kurdish property. There have been human rights violations. There have been clashes with the PKK over time. So this whole situation has been quite complex and essentially not easily resolved. And there was also a potential. Erdogan started perceiving the rising Kurdish nationalism in Syria as a potential threat for creating contiguous territorial control that could threaten Turkish territorial integrity, as he saw it, because he was concerned that the Turks living in the areas bordering Syria would join their counterparts in Syria in a liberation movement, or essentially a civil war against Turkey, and split the country apart. Frankly, I think this was a very ill-perceived excuse and justification to crack down on Kurds and engage in human rights violations, because whereas it is true that in Syria there was an autonomous region, Kurdish region, Rojava, being built, there is no evidence that there was any plan for some massive revolt. If anything, many of the Turkish Kurds could have migrated to that Syrian enclave and simply found a way to coexist in this semi-autonomous vision of coexistence. There was also at one point a plan for Kurdish state in Iran that was also supported by the Soviet Union, only lasted a year. The closest to the state building would have been in Iraqi Kurdistan, where the Kurdish area is essentially almost distinctly separated from the Sunni and Shia controlled areas, but the dispute over oil and gas, which is found mostly in that particular region around Erbil, made this a no-go with Iranian authorities and even with Baghdad. So essentially Kurds ended up being ill-served by geographic splits and divisions and interests of the states that were created without their reckoning. And so there's no real easy solution to this conflict, but what we do know is that the current Turkish government has also been using these disputes as a kind of a way to scapegoat, to distract from economic and political problems, to create this sort of a nationalist unity between the former Kemalist parties and AKP, which has been losing popularity for other reasons. And just recently, once again, there was talk of Turkey allegedly promising to finally resolve this Kurdish issue, to return to talks with the PKK, and there's been a talk about some improvement of relations, but no clear plan. Many of the Kurdish mayors had been forcefully removed from power without any real trials. The Kurdish leadership lost its political immunity. The parliamentarians lost their political immunity. They were accused of cooperating with PKK during the 2016 revolt by the military. Erdogan blamed a lot of this revolt on the PKK and used the revolt as an excuse to purge a lot of the political class that was opposed to his policies for other reasons. Whether or not they were PKK, it was a way to scapegoat people, and also it ended up driving people looking for some sort of an organized opposition into PKK's arms. So there's really no easy way of summarizing this very complex conflict. In terms of countries and organizations supporting the Kurdish groups, there's a huge deal of diversity among Kurds. There are multiple different parties, which at various points in times even conflicted with each other. Without a question, at one point the Soviet Union was a supporter during the Cold War, whereas Turkey was perceived to be as pro-Western. It was a member of NATO, and it very much sided with the United States against communists and socialists. After the fall of the Soviet Union, for a while the West has tried to work with the Kurds in various capacities. During the rise of ISIS, U.S., which never removed the Turkish PKK from its terrorism list, did align with the Syrian counterparts, the YDP and so forth, created a group of Kurds and Sunni Arabs and others called the SDF, which was supposed to fight against ISIS. It was also opposed to some of the Iran-backed and pro-Assad incursions, and at some point the Russians too tried to play some of the Kurdish elements, particularly in Syria, against Turkey. That was before Russia and Turkey sort of sorted out their differences, came to a sort of a rapprochement over other unrelated issues. Essentially, those Kurds ended up feeling abandoned both by the West, that never protected them from, and by Russia, which also made false promises, but eventually created sort of a united front with Turkey over certain matters. And of course, in Iraqi Kurdistan, Iran has at various times tried to co-opt some of the Kurdish parties, and on the other hand, there was also conflict between the PKK and the Kurdistan regional government, which had good relations with Turkey and exchanged and traded oil. Some of those differences were overcome after Turkey attacked northern Iraq, where it also sought to restore its Ottoman-era military base. In terms of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict,
So, what role has Israel played in Turkish-Kurdish conflict, particularly after Edna Accord?
Israel has not been all that directly involved. Israel has been much more involved with the Iraqi Kurds in terms of energy exchanges, in terms of Kurds helping Jewish Iraqis who have been denationalized, to smuggling them to Israel. Certainly, in terms of sort of pre-Erdogan era, Israel had very good relations with Turkey, the state, and it did not have particularly great relations with Turkish Kurds, who were, for the most part, socialist and therefore not particularly fond of Israel at that point, and B, they were not particularly useful to Israel in terms of any particular capacity. The Kurdish and Iranian Kurds were much more useful because Israel did have conflicts with Iraq and Iran. Later, the situation started changing after Erdogan became increasingly a problem for the Turkish Kurds, and after the rise of ISIS and Iran in Syria, Israel started cooperating with the Syrian Kurds a lot more. That also left an opening to the Kurds in Turkey. But again, the Turkish conflict was not with all the Kurds everywhere at one point. It was initially focused on Turkish and then Syrian Kurds. Um, Turkey's conflict with Kurds expanded over time as Turkey grew its own relations with Iran and started cooperating with Iran, which itself was very much, on the one hand, trying to co-opt some of the Kurds in Iran and Iraq, but on the other hand, also created resentment with its own policies against Iranian Kurds and also Iraqi Kurds. So as Turkey and Iran grew closer, Kurds and Israel eventually became that historically held up. Now, even to this point, this involvement is not really formal. It may consist of some limited Israel-based academic work, human rights work, some level of contacts while in Turkey, but there has not been a full or open support for the Kurdish national movement in Turkey or anything like that. For one thing, Israel has had its hands full with dealing with assorted terrorist groups in the region and its own security concerns. And second, there's been a very messy situation in Syria, which has been for Israel much more of a priority. So, to the extent it cooperated with Kurds, it was mostly cooperated against ISIS and Iran, and not so much against the Turkish government.
What motivated PKK to attack on Turkish aerospace agency working on fifth generational fighter jet program? And what message does this send?
With respect to the aerospace agency attack, Turkey claimed that it was PKK, but PKK has not taken responsibility for this attack. In some ways, it fits the PKK modus operandi because it's an attack on a government project and not specifically on civilians, even if civilians got killed or hurt. Um, However, it is not. In recent years, there were also attacks by ISIS, which fit the modus operandi of ISIS and were mass attacks on both government and non-government targets that Turkey nevertheless attributed to the PKK until there is clear evidence pointing to the PKK. It's too early to say that it was in fact PKK, but the attack could mean that all the talk about the Turkish-Kurdish rapprochement may be just optics, fake news, rumors, and hearsay, and behind the scenes, the tensions continued. It could also be that that a splinter group from PKK, which became active, took on a rogue operation, knowing that there are ongoing peace talks or some sort of discussions, and trying to preempt or disrupt them because they never agreed to some of the new structure that PKK took on, which includes limitations on stopping attacks on civilians or going by the mainstream political and diplomatic organizational line, which in this case could mean re-engaging in talks with the Turkish government. In some ways, such PKK in the past certainly attacked government targets for sure, and even civilian targets during the 70s. But this is but an attack on an aerospace organization is quite sophisticated. It would require a degree of intelligence and logistics that suspect terrorist groups that are very much a subject of intense surveillance by the Turkish states would be difficult to pull off for whatever reason. In any case, for PKK, if they attack, it's in their interest to take the responsibility and claim credit for the attack, because that is literally the whole point of their resistance, to show their strength against the Turkish state. So, because nobody has taken this responsibility for this attack, it's very difficult to discern the message. Although the message is clearly political, it's clearly an opposition to the Turkish government, but for what reason and by whom, that is not clear. And until there's clear evidence pointing to the organizers of the attack, it will be very hard to say what that message specifically is supposed to be, other than the general opposition to the Turkish government. There are many who have disputed the elections.
So, is there any direct link between attack on Turkish Aerospace Agency and BRICS summit, or was the timing coincidental?
Now, the BRICS summit attended by Erdogan certainly created, what would be a good reason to pull off an attack, and generally attacks on government targets can be seen as linked to national events. It's a good way to attract attention, but whether it's the opposition of a particular group to Turkey trying to enter BRICS for whatever reason, or whether it's a political opportunism by unrelated parties who are simply using the occasion because that's the event that's going on, and it's a big deal and it's a good way to get attention. That's also unclear, simply because we don't know who is really behind it yet.
How will the attack impact regional dynamics, particularly in relation to Turkey's relation with other countries in the Middle East? And lastly, what are the potential consequences of this attack on Turkish Kurdish conflict, and how might it escalate or de escalate tensions?
I don't think the timing is entirely coincidental. I think any major international event is always tied to terrorism efforts, as we have seen with the Paris hosting of the Olympics. There were multiple different parties attempting or talking about committing terrorist attacks. There were Russians for their own reasons, and there were the ISIS-K from Afghanistan who had their own agenda, um, and it's simply a good timing to get attention regardless of the agenda. But the nature of that threat and the nature of the link between BRICS and whoever is behind it will not be fully understood until we know exactly who is behind it. If it was PKK, then for them it was simply an opportunity to get attention. Erdogan is away, BRICS summit is going on. There's a lot of attention on that, and it's a great way to also kind of, get attention. If it was some other opposition group that's opposed to Turkish gravitation to BRICS, or that simply is against any international cooperation, that could be a reason as well. I don't think this particular attack will impact regional dynamics, but in this case, the most likely culprit would again be PKK, and maybe it could serve as a justification in that case to take a tougher stand, for instance, in Syria or northern Iraq. But other than that, these internal domestic attacks, when it's not clear who is behind them, but regardless, unless it turns out that this group is linked to some foreign entity, there is no way that it's going to be really disrupting Turkish relations with others. One of the biggest projects ongoing right now is the economic corridor from Iraq to Turkey. Could an attack on the aerospace agency be linked to that, be a message of some sort regarding the security of that passageway? Could it be related to groups that concerned about this economic corridor's competition? The one party that would be actually best served by disrupting the corridor But we can say that because Turkey, before even investigating, already blamed the attack on PKK, it will probably upend any discussions we heard recently about rapprochement, if they were even ongoing to begin with. And certainly it will escalate tensions, create much more of a surveillance state, not only against PKK or anyone related to that, but against any other potential opposition groups.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to Irina Tsukerman for an incredibly insightful discussion, offering us a unique perspective on this complex issue. We truly appreciate your expertise and thoughtful analysis. So, viewers, tomorrow we will dive even deeper into the topic with senior journalist and geopolitical expert Mr. Muhammad Lukman, who will offer us a fresh viewpoint and additional argument on the matter. Thank you all for tuning in. We hope this conversation provided you with valuable insight. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, good night, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.